The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like restless spirits as Ayanna Blackhorse adjusted the beaded earrings her grandmother had given her, the only adornment the court would allow beyond her crisp navy suit. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity her elders had taught her. But today that composure masked a storm brewing since childhood. Across the courtroom's sterile divide sat Officer Michael Torres, his uniform pressed, his jaw set in the familiar expression of institutional certainty she'd witnessed too many times. The case had begun 18 months ago when Torres arrested Ayanna's 15-year-old nephew Marcus outside the tribal community center. The official report claimed Marcus had been acting suspiciously and resisted arrest. But the cell phone footage that surfaced weeks later told a different story. A boy walking home from basketball practice suddenly slammed against a patrol car for the crime of existing while indigenous in his own neighborhood. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered with the weight of precedent trailing behind her black robes. She'd built her career on law and order, rarely questioning the system that had elevated her from a working-class background to the bench. Today, however, something flickered in her eyes as she surveyed the packed courtroom. Tribal members filling one side, uniformed officers occupying the other, with an invisible chasm of mistrust stretching between them. Ayanna's attorney, Sarah Whitehawk, possessed the sharp intellect of someone who'd fought these battles before. As one of the first Indigenous women to graduate from the state's most prestigious law school, she understood the delicate balance required to challenge systemic injustice without alienating the very system she needed to navigate. Her opening statement would need to thread the needle between righteous anger and judicial respectability. Torres shifted uncomfortably as Ayanna's gaze found his. He'd grown up in this same community, had even dated an Indigenous girl in high school before. His father, a career cop, reminded him about appropriate associations. The department had trained him well in procedure and protocol, but no academy course had prepared him for the weight of actually looking into the eyes of someone whose life he'd fundamentally altered with split-second decisions rooted in assumptions he'd never examined. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Sullivan, represented more than legal authority. He embodied a system that had spent generations perfecting the art of criminalizing Indigenous existence. His grandfather had been present during the forced relocations of the 1950s. His father had prosecuted Indigenous activists in the 1970s, and now he continued the family tradition with the righteousness of someone who genuinely believed he was protecting society from dangerous elements. As the proceedings began, Ayanna felt the ancestral strength flowing through her veins, the same blood that had survived removal, boarding schools, and countless attempts at cultural erasure. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "Our truth has power, granddaughter. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to speak what others refuse to hear." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hendricks called the session to order, unaware that she was presiding over more than a simple assault case. This moment represented the collision of two worldviews, one that saw law enforcement as inherently just and another that had learned through bitter experience that justice was something you fought for, never something freely given. The prosecution's case unfolded with mechanical precision, each witness reinforcing the narrative of a dangerous youth who had threatened public safety. Officer Rodriguez testified about Torres's exemplary service record, carefully avoiding mention of the 3 excessive force complaints filed against him in the past 2 years, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. The department's training sergeant spoke about split-second decisions and officer safety, painting Marcus as a potential threat who had made suspicious movements during the encounter. But Sarah Whitehawk had done her homework. During cross-examination, she revealed the pattern hidden beneath official reports: 17 arrests of Indigenous youth in the past 6 months, all for vague charges like disorderly conduct and suspicious behavior, with conviction rates barely reaching 20%. The statistics painted a picture of harassment disguised as law enforcement, a systematic campaign to criminalize Indigenous presence in their own community. Ayanna watched Torres's face as the evidence mounted. She recognized something familiar in his expression, the same conflict she'd seen in her own nephew's eyes after his arrest, the struggle between what you've been taught to believe and what you know to be true. Torres hadn't started his career intending to become an instrument of oppression, but the machinery of institutional racism had shaped him nevertheless. The turning point came when Dr. Elena Spotted Eagle took the stand. As a trauma psychologist, specializing in indigenous communities, she explained the intergenerational impact of police violence, how each encounter with law enforcement re-triggered collective memories of historical trauma. Her testimony wasn't just about Marcus's case. It illuminated the broader context of how indigenous people experienced every police interaction through the lens of centuries of state violence. When Officer Torres approached Marcus, Dr. Spotted Eagle explained, he wasn't just encountering a teenager walking home. He was the latest representative of a system that has consistently viewed indigenous bodies as inherently dangerous, indigenous movements as suspicious, and indigenous presence as something to be controlled. Judge Hendricks found herself confronting uncomfortable truths about the system she'd faithfully served. The evidence suggested that the very institutions she'd trusted to deliver justice had been systematically denying it to entire communities. Her usual certainty began to crack as she realized that upholding law and order might sometimes mean perpetuating profound injustice. Torres's partner, Officer Janet Morrison, provided the day's most devastating testimony, not through her words, but through her silences. When asked about department culture, she hesitated. When questioned about racial bias training, she looked away. Her body language spoke volumes about the toxic environment that had normalized the systematic targeting of indigenous youth. The defense presented expert testimony about implicit bias in policing, statistical analysis of arrest patterns, and historical context about the relationship between law enforcement and indigenous communities. Each piece of evidence built upon the others, creating an undeniable picture of systemic discrimination operating under the guise of public safety. As the day concluded, Ayanna felt the weight of her community's hopes and fears. This case had become more than seeking justice for Marcus. It represented a chance to force the system to acknowledge its own biases, to create accountability where none had existed before. But she also understood the forces arrayed against them, the institutional resistance to admitting systemic failure. Torres sat alone during the recess, isolated from his fellow officers who sensed his growing doubt. The certainty that had once defined his professional identity was crumbling, replaced by questions he'd never allowed himself to ask. For the first time, he began to see his actions through different eyes, not as necessary police work, but as participation in a system designed to criminalize indigenous existence. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted palpably by the third day, with reporters now filling the back rows and tribal elders offering silent support from the gallery. Ayanna felt their presence like a protective circle, their weathered faces, reflecting both the pain of historical trauma and the fierce hope for transformative change. Today would determine whether justice was possible within a system built on their exclusion. Sarah Whitehawk called her final witness, Marcus himself. The teenager walked to the stand with the careful dignity his aunt had taught him. His basketball, Letterman jacket a defiant reminder of the normal adolescence that had been interrupted by institutional violence. His testimony was quiet but powerful, describing not just the physical assault but the psychological impact of being treated as a criminal for simply existing in his own community. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I was walking home from practice thinking about homework and whether my jump shot was improving. Then suddenly I'm face down on the concrete, being told I'm a threat to public safety. I keep wondering what I did to deserve that, and the only answer I can find is that I looked like someone they expected to be dangerous." The prosecutor's cross-examination attempted to portray Marcus as evasive and potentially violent, but the teenager's composure never wavered. He answered each question with the careful precision of someone who understood that his words carried the hopes of his entire community. When asked if he held any anger toward Officer Torres, his response surprised everyone. "I'm not angry at him personally," Marcus said. "I'm angry at the system that taught him to see me as a threat. Officer Torres probably thought he was doing his job, but his job was based on assumptions about people who look like me. That's what needs to change." Torres felt something break inside him as he listened to the teenager's testimony. The boy he'd arrested wasn't a criminal or a threat. He was a kid with dreams and fears, a student athlete whose biggest concern should have been passing algebra, not surviving police encounters. The realization forced Torres to confront the uncomfortable truth about his own actions and motivations. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, sensing the emotional intensity building in the courtroom. During the break, an elderly tribal member approached the bench, Joe Blackhorse, Ayana's grandfather and a respected community elder. His presence commanded attention from both sides of the courtroom divide. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I've lived through 8 decades of watching our young people criminalized for breathing while indigenous. I've seen generations of our children learn to fear those sworn to protect them. Today isn't just about my great-nephew Marcus. It's about whether this system can finally acknowledge its failures and choose differently." The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like morning mist, carrying the accumulated grief and resilience of countless indigenous families who had faced similar injustices. Judge Hendricks found herself thinking about her own grandchildren, trying to imagine how she would feel if they were systematically targeted simply for their ancestry. When testimony concluded, Sarah Whitehawk's closing argument was a masterpiece of controlled passion and legal precision. She didn't ask the court to destroy the system of law enforcement, but to hold it accountable to its own stated principles of equal justice under law. Her words painted a vision of public safety that protected everyone, including the communities that law enforcement had too often criminalized. The prosecutor's closing argument felt hollow by comparison, relying on tired rhetoric about supporting law enforcement, without acknowledging the evidence of systemic bias that had been presented. Even some of the officers in attendance seemed uncomfortable with the stark contrast between the prosecution's portrayal of events and the documented reality of what had occurred. As Judge Hendricks prepared to deliberate, she understood that her decision would resonate far beyond this single case. The evidence had revealed not just individual misconduct, but institutional patterns that demanded acknowledgement and reform. The question was whether she possessed the courage to use her position to catalyze meaningful change. The 24 hours following closing arguments felt suspended in time, as if the entire community was holding its breath. Ayana spent the night at her grandmother's house, participating in traditional prayers and ceremonies that had sustained their people through countless struggles. The old woman's hands, weathered by decades of beadwork and healing touch, pressed sage into her granddaughter's palms. "Whatever happens tomorrow," her grandmother whispered, "you've already changed something important. Truth has been spoken in that courtroom, truth that can't be taken back or forgotten. Sometimes that's where justice begins, even when the verdict disappoints us." Meanwhile, Officer Torres sat in his apartment, staring at commendations and awards that suddenly felt hollow. His partner Morrison had stopped returning his calls, and the thin blue line that had once felt like protection now seemed more like isolation. The testimony had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own motivations, his training, and the culture that had shaped his approach to policing indigenous communities. Judge Hendricks spent the night reviewing case law and precedent, but found herself returning again and again to Dr. Spotted Eagle's testimony about intergenerational trauma. She'd built her career on the belief that justice was blind, but the evidence had revealed how blindness to systemic inequality could perpetuate profound injustice. Her decision would need to balance legal precedent with moral courage. The next morning arrived with unseasonable clarity, autumn light streaming through the courtroom windows as if nature itself was bearing witness. The gallery filled with an even more diverse crowd: tribal members, civil rights activists, law enforcement supporters, and community members who had never set foot in a courtroom before, but understood that something significant was happening. Judge Hendricks entered with visible gravity, her usual brisk confidence replaced by the weight of someone who understood the historical moment she was navigating. The silence was absolute as she began to speak, her words carefully chosen to acknowledge both the legal standards she was bound to uphold and the broader context that demanded recognition. "This case has revealed evidence of a pattern of behavior that extends beyond the individual incident involving Marcus Blackhorse," she began. "While I cannot adjudicate the entire history of law enforcement's relationship with indigenous communities, I can address the specific instance of misconduct that brought us here today." Her finding of guilt against Officer Torres sent shockwaves through both sides of the courtroom. Vindication for those who had fought for accountability, dismay for those who believed in automatic deference to law enforcement. But her subsequent comments proved even more significant than the verdict itself. This court recognizes that individual accountability, while necessary, is insufficient to address systemic problems that require institutional change, Judge Hendricks continued. I am therefore ordering a comprehensive review of police practices and training in this jurisdiction, with particular attention to interactions with indigenous community members. Torres absorbed the verdict with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The legal consequences were significant: suspension from duty, mandatory retraining, community service. But the personal reckoning felt even more profound. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the possibility that good intentions weren't enough to justify harmful actions. The courtroom erupted in a complex mixture of celebration and continued tension. Some saw the verdict as long overdue justice, while others viewed it as an attack on law enforcement itself. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Torres approached Marcus and his family, removing his badge and extending his hand. I was wrong, he said simply. I'm sorry for what I put you through, and I want to do better. The gesture didn't erase the harm that had been done, but it represented a crack in the institutional wall of silence that typically protected officers from accountability. 6 months after the verdict, the reverberations continued to spread through the community like ripples in still water. Officer Torres had completed his mandated training and was working with indigenous community leaders to develop new protocols for police interactions. The transformation wasn't complete. Years of ingrained bias couldn't be erased overnight, but the willingness to engage in honest dialogue represented progress that had seemed impossible before the trial. Ayanna had returned to her work as a tribal social worker, but found herself increasingly involved in police reform initiatives. The case had thrust her into a reluctant spotlight as a voice for indigenous rights, a role she accepted with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the trial. She spoke at conferences and training sessions, not as someone seeking to demonize law enforcement, but as an advocate for justice that truly served all community members. Marcus had initially struggled with the attention the case brought him, the weight of being a symbol for broader injustices when he simply wanted to be a normal teenager. But with his aunt's guidance and community support, he'd found ways to channel his experience into positive action. He started a youth group focused on Know Your Rights education, teaching other indigenous teenagers how to navigate police encounters safely while maintaining their dignity and cultural identity. Judge Hendricks had faced criticism from some quarters for her decision, with law enforcement organizations questioning her loyalty to public safety. But she'd also received unexpected support from reform-minded officers who recognized that accountability actually strengthened legitimate policing by removing bad actors and building community trust. Her courage in acknowledging systemic problems had opened space for honest conversations about policing that had been previously impossible. The mandated police review had produced concrete changes, new training requirements, revised protocols for community interactions, and oversight mechanisms that provided real accountability. More importantly, it had created ongoing dialogue between law enforcement and indigenous community leaders, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual suspicion. Not everyone was satisfied with the changes. Some community members felt the reforms were inadequate given the scope of historical injustice, while some officers resented what they perceived as unfair scrutiny of their profession. The path forward remained complex and contested, requiring constant vigilance and continued advocacy. But on quiet evenings when Ayanna visited her grandmother, the old woman would smile and point to her great-grandson Marcus, now confident and engaged in community leadership despite his early trauma. Change doesn't happen all at once, she would say, her hands still working intricate beadwork patterns passed down through generations. It happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Torres had become an unexpected ally in reform efforts, using his insider knowledge to help identify problematic practices and training gaps. His journey, From perpetrator to advocate hadn't been easy. He'd faced ostracism from some former colleagues and skepticism from community members who questioned his sincerity. But his willingness to confront his own biases and work toward meaningful change had gradually earned respect from both sides. The case had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges, demonstrating that justice was possible, even within imperfect systems when individuals found the courage to speak truth to power. It hadn't solved the larger problems of systemic racism or police misconduct, but it had proven that accountability was achievable and that transformation, while difficult, was possible. As Ayanna watched her nephew graduate from high school, an achievement that had seemed uncertain during his darkest moments after the arrest, she reflected on the long arc of justice her grandmother had taught her to recognize. Change was slow and imperfect, but it was real, and in a world where Indigenous voices had too often been silenced, their truth had finally been heard, acknowledged, and acted upon. The weight of truth, she realized, was both burden and blessing. Heavy, enough to demand courage, but powerful enough to move mountains.